From WKNOW, this is Steve Chanley with One Question Too Many. Today's program is made possible by the law firm of Employer Advocates Group, serving California employers since 2002, with offices in Orange County and San Luis Obispo County, California. eaglawgroup.com. Joining us today as my guest host is Ray Wheeler. Ray's retired now, but he was the chair of the Labor and Employment Practice Group at Morrison & Foerster. Thanks for being here, Ray.
I'm glad to be here.
Also joining us today as our guest is Professor Austen Parrish. Professor Parrish is the Dean and Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. He serves as the President of the Association of American Law Schools and is a longtime standing member of the Board of Directors of AccessLex Institute. Dean Parrish also serves as a co-editor of the Journal of Legal Education. He was appointed as dean at UC Irvine in 2022 and is only the third dean in that school's brief history. Thanks for being with us today, Dean Parrish.
Yeah, Steve, great to be on. Thanks for having me.
How many years have you been teaching law?
It's just over 23. I started in July of 2002.
Before you embarked on your career in legal academia, you were a practicing attorney at O'Melveny & Myers in Los Angeles. What was the nature of your law practice?
That was just an absolutely fabulous experience. So I was an attorney in the litigation department of O'Melveny, but the work was varied and all over the country. So I had some cases in state court, some in federal court. I worked on a very large Walker Process antitrust intellectual property case that involved a trial that lasted, I think over 16 weeks, over 2 summers. Did some civil rights, did a large amount of work around telecommunication deregulation and some smaller matters involving construction defects. It was a real range. And then I had a large amount of pro bono work, which the firm supported during my time there. So it was a pretty traditional litigation practice, but with some fascinating work.
What made you decide to become a legal educator after working at one of the premier big law firms?
So it was more personal than anything else. I really enjoyed what I was doing, but I was working long hours and I was traveling a lot. And my eldest daughter was being born, and I joined a law school and started teaching on a 1-year contract the same week that my first daughter was born. And so it was sort of a combination of a number of things. It was a wonderful opportunity to enter academia, and so I grabbed it while I could, and it worked perfectly from a personal perspective.
In preparation for this episode, I did quite a bit of reading up on you. In many of the pieces, you were praised for your legal scholarship in particular. Would you say that Columbia University better prepared you to teach law or to practice it?
That's an interesting question, Steve. I really enjoyed my time at Columbia, and I had some really amazing faculty and inspiring classmates. So in some ways, it really helped me prepare for practice. It gave me that critical thinking, how to think like a lawyer, the traditional training. But on the other hand, I had great experiences. I externed for a federal judge while I was in law school. I represented clients in an Employment Action Center pro bono project, did a bunch of things. On the other hand, can't say that Columbia was particularly practice-oriented, and I had a steep learning curve when I first joined the firm for how to actually practice law. And then on teaching side, law teaching has changed a lot. So although I had amazing people, which I look up to, and I got to work with some really wonderful faculty, I'd have to say some of the things that I'm doing today are not the way that law was taught when I went to law school. It's just changed a lot. So it's a hard question. In some ways, this sounds strange, but my undergraduate experience might have actually prepared me better for law teaching. I was fortunate that I was going to undergraduate just as things was changing in Eastern Europe, the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I got to study with a number of scholars who were doing international and transnational work, which is an area of law that I ended up writing on. So in some ways, my undergraduate experience might have prepared me for the writing side of things, for law teaching and being a faculty member. But the short answer is Columbia was an amazing experience, and I think it prepared me incredibly well for law practice. And then it was a great foundation for later becoming a legal academic.
Dean Parrish, how big of an adjustment was it to go from practicing law to teaching law?
It's strangely not that big, really. And I think partly it's because I started teaching in courses that were fairly closely aligned with practice. I taught civil procedure, I taught legal writing, I taught civil pretrial practice, I later taught federal courts. But I have to say, some of the things that I learned in practice, how to communicate complicated ideas in a fairly concise way, how to think in an organized way or present in an organized way, took those to heart and used those sort of techniques for when I first started teaching. I remember one of the first classes I taught, I had to present something for an arbitration I was in and used basically the same approach and structure that I did for the first class of breaking it down. I found actually in the early days, the skills that legal practice had taught me, writing quickly and effectively and hopefully communicating in a clear way, were sort of the core skills I needed to be used as a young faculty member.
Well, you've largely answered my next question that I had for you, which is how you feel having practiced law has made you a bit better legal educator. But looking at it from a longer term perspective, do you think it's continued to help make you a better educator?
I think so. As I look back, I've been a dean now for quite some time. And as a dean, a lot of what you're doing is you're problem solving. You're thinking about how to think creatively about a particular issue that's either challenging your colleagues, faculty, or staff or students. And then how do you move forward? And that sort of strategic thinking is exactly what you do as a lawyer. Or at least in my experience, what you're trying to do is provide good advice and think through in a thoughtful and systematic way how to help a client out of a particular situation. Now, some of that might have been in the context of a litigation strategy, but sometimes that was just more broadly thinking through how a client might negotiate a particular tricky situation. And that's a lot of what you're doing as a law school dean. You're thinking strategically about how you move the institution forward and how you provide a great educational experience for your students and how you create an environment that's conducive to your faculty and staff performing at the highest level. And that sort of problem-solving core, I think, is true in practice, or at least that's my sense of what makes a good lawyer. And I think to some extent that's helpful for being a good faculty member and certainly being a good administrator. And so when I look back, I feel very fortunate. I got to work with some absolutely amazing lawyers at O'Melveny and just very grateful for their mentorship and the time I worked with them. And I think it's created a strong foundation that served me well as a faculty member.
You just mentioned the length of your career so far as a dean. Before you were a dean at UC Irvine, you were the dean and professor of law at Indiana University School of Law. Can you tell our listeners about some of the initiatives that you brought to fruition at IU while you were there?
Happy to. And, I should say, deans are only as good as the faculty and the staff they get to work with. And so I was fortunate that I just had some wonderful people there, people that were incredibly hardworking. I was proud to be part of some of this, but a lot of it was sort of a team effort. So, it was a very difficult time for legal education when I was dean, or when I started dean at Indiana University. It was right after the Great Recession. There was the massive declines in applications to law schools. And there was a lot of misinformation out in the public about what law schools were doing and how they were preparing students. So it was a tough time. But we did a lot of good. We hired some amazing people over the 8.5 years I was there. We lowered debt levels of students. We created new scholarship programs. We established some new clinics and new pro bono programs. We completed a $60 million capital campaign, created 7 new professorships. We endowed the first ever clinical chair. We named the moot courtroom. We named the Office of Student Affairs. We named the law library, which is an amazing law library. We created the first family office program for law students in the nation. I was fortunate. I managed to negotiate the first scholarship partnership with the U.S. Army JAG Corps, which was really a terrific program. We negotiated scholarship agreements with 4 engineering undergraduate programs for students interested in intellectual property law. We created, I think, scholarship programs with probably another dozen liberal arts schools throughout the country. And then we became the first school to have a partnership with Fulbright UK and Fulbright Hungary, and one of the first schools to have partnerships with Fulbright Ireland and Fulbright Mexico to support international lawyers who wanted to spend a year in the United States. And then there was lots of other things. We created a new Bachelor in Science in Law and Public Policy with the School of Public and Environmental Affairs there. We created a new Bachelor of Arts in International Law and Institutions with IU's Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies. We've created a new MS in our Masters in Cybersecurity Risk Management with the Business School and the the engineering and computing school. So it was an exciting time to be there. And so I was proud. Proud because of what we collectively accomplished. But I think among the best is that we had an alumni that was incredibly supportive. We were able to create new programs at a time that was very difficult for legal education. We were able to reduce the debt loads. And if you can do any of that stuff, I think you can look back and say you had a good run. And so it was a special time in my life there to be in Bloomington, and I just had amazing colleagues. And I think we achieved quite a lot in that short period of time.
After accomplishing so much at Indiana University, what was it about the opportunity at UC Irvine that was compelling to you?
UC Irvine is just an amazing school. The number of schools that have been created over the last 40 years that have been successful, and there's been a lot that has been created, it's pretty small. A number of them that launch, close, or are unable to get started. And the trajectory of Irvine has just been remarkable. And it has a lot of the things that I think makes for a really good law school. We've got faculty that are at the very top of their fields nationally and internationally. There's this amazingly deep commitment to giving back to the community. There's this idea that being a good lawyer involves not just learning the law, but also learning how to engage with clients in the community and give back. So we have this just extraordinary public interest pro bono program, which I think is not only good for the community, I think it makes better lawyers. And just a lot of excitement when you're at a new school, at a startup, everybody's sort of pulling in the same direction. And that's exciting for a dean. So one, there was a lot to do with the school itself. It's just a remarkable school with a great history. And then on the personal side, my wife is from the Santa Ana Tustin area. Her brother lives in Irvine. Her family's in the area. And so an opportunity for us to return to California. I love my time in Indiana and Bloomington, but I have to say in the middle of winter, in the middle of summer, it's hard to beat the Orange County weather.
UCI's law school is the newest of the 5 law schools in the University of California system. By contrast, the law school at Indiana University was founded in 1842. Newness of UCI's law school somehow affords you more flexibility in charting this course going forward?
Yeah, it's sort of a mixed answer. So in some ways, absolutely. The newness means there's lots to work with. The faculty and staff are excited to be here. They feel very much part of building something exceptional and new. We're not stuck in sort of the older ways of doing things. We don't have faculty that remember that there was some sort of disagreement in 1972 with some other faculty member that they can't quite remember, but it's still, so we don't have that stuff. The history here at UC Irvine has been one of innovation and nimbleness. And our faculty have this tremendous capacity to be willing to rethink what they're doing in the classroom and to expand their engagement with the community. And they're willing to do that on a repeated basis. And that's unusual. And that's part of our culture. That said, I've got to be honest, the University of California system is a very large and very complicated system. And so although I think there's some more flexibility by the nature of the newness of the school, you're dealing with a more complicated legal market. In Indiana, I remembered I would see the Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court on a pretty regular basis. And if there was an issue with the bar, I could pick up the phone. I'm not running into the California Supreme Court justices every afternoon. And so there is a different level of complexity in California in the UC system, which constrains some of the things that we're able to do. But yeah, no, broadly, I think the newness, it does have that startup mentality. And you feel that with the students and you feel that with the alumni, which means that people are a little more willing to say, wait a second, we don't need to be stuck with what we've done before. We can try something more ambitious and maybe do something that other schools haven't done. And that's exciting. And also very exciting for a dean to be able to have that sort of...
Dean, it's been more decades than I care to admit since I was a law student. I go back to the days of the seating charts with pictures and the intimidating professor firing Socratic questions at the students, sometimes for the poor victim for 10 or 15 minutes. So I cannot even pretend to know what the modern law school experience is like. For example, there was literally no discussion or instruction about the actual practice of law. How have law schools changed to address the need for practical skills development?
I think there's been a lot of changes over the last, let's say, 15 to 20 years, and even more so in the last decade. Now, that doesn't mean that faculty still don't do a little bit of Socratic method. It's not as brutal as it used to be. And so I very much like the Socratic, but I stick with people for short periods of time. But to give you an example, most programs now have very professionalized and sophisticated legal writing and lawyering skills program. Schools have dramatically expanded clinical education. We have over a dozen clinics here that are operating at any given time. There's a number of courses focused on the legal profession itself. And so, as you described, when I was in law school, there was no discussion about the business of law or understanding how firms were structured different or how you might make different careers. And that's changed. Pro bono programs have grown dramatically at many law schools. A big expansion of drafting courses related to entrepreneurship in the law, courses on law firm practice management, growth of courses around law and technology. And I think a lot of schools now have a lot deeper relationships with the bar associations that are in their communities. Now, I should say there is a sense that law schools are doing all the same things, and there's some truth to that, but there's also a lot of variation geographically. And so although most schools are still fairly similar in for what the core courses are, you also see variations depending on where you are. And being in a large legal community like in Los Angeles or Orange County or San Diego or San Francisco is quite different than if you're, in a small town in New Hampshire, where it's just a different type of market. And so you do see regional differences, but a lot more cognizance around the need to develop skills-based education. And although still, I think the core and the bread and butter of law school is still teaching students how to think like a lawyer, become critical thinkers, become problem solvers, there's a recognition that you also need to teach students, at least give them an introduction to some of those skills they're going to see early on in their career. I mentioned some of them. A lot of it's focused on litigation, but you've also seen a dramatic increase in skills relating to negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and a greater emphasis on transactional drafting type courses in a way that didn't exist even 10 or 15 years ago.
Maybe you can talk about this a bit. How important are internships in clinical instruction and developing practice skills, and maybe describe how they work?
Yeah, so here at UC Irvine, we have a mandatory clinical experience that each student has to take 6 credits. And they're essentially in a small law firm where there will be a faculty member who's got a lot of practical experience, has been a practicing attorney for a significant amount of time before they went into academia. And they will normally have 8 students that are in the first part of the program, and then they might have some returning students that are upper division. And they're representing live clients, essentially running little small law firms. So we have 10 of those run by full-time faculty, and then we have anywhere between 3 and 6 run by part-time faculty that are advanced clinics. And then we have an externship program where students can do externships or internships with local judges and nonprofit organizations, government entities. I think they're critical. So, oftentimes this is the first introduction that students have to working with real clients. It allows them to take some of the things that they've learned, either the substantive knowledge of other courses or writing skills or interviewing skills, and put them to actual use and do that in an environment where you have a very talented, experienced lawyer who's providing you guidance step by step. And that is hard to get when you're out in practice. I just remembered when I was in practice, you'd have to do motion practice. And it's different when you have to go in front of a judge than when you can do it, in a mock situation where you've got somebody's experience that can correct you and nudge you and tell you how you need to change things. And so I think those sort of practical skills are important. They also do 2 other things. One, they give students confidence that it's not impossible to be a highly skilled lawyer early on. And it also sets the standard of quality. And if you don't get that sort of standard of quality about what it means to be a good lawyer and able to see what good lawyering looks like, it's hard to do that on your own. And so some people are very fortunate. They get to work with amazing attorneys and they get to mimic and mirror what they're saying. But others are not so fortunate. And having that experience in law school with trained professionals who are very experienced in not only their area of law, but also how to teach it in a clinical environment is important to getting students off on the right step and hopefully lead to a trajectory of excellence while they're a lawyer. And I think the profession needs that. It needs to have that sort of skills development of what it means to be a good lawyer and a good professional.
Does UCI use pro bono opportunities to help students get practical experience as well?
Yes, absolutely. We have one of the largest pro bono programs in the country. When I was at Indiana University Bloomington, which had a great program, we had maybe 6 or 7 pro bono projects at any given time. We would work with the federal penitentiary system, with the local bar association. At UC Irvine, we have over 100 pro bono projects in every semester, and we're working with law firms that need additional assistance on pro bono briefs or public interest briefs, with local nonprofits, legal aid organizations, with government entities, and it ranges, right? It can work with something like the Public Law Center, which provides free civil legal services here in Orange County, doing homelessness or low-income tax work, to working with Surfrider Company doing water quality stuff on the beaches. And so it ranges, and it allows students in the very first year to do maybe a 10-hour or 20-hour project, but get a sense of what real lawyering looks like. And to be honest, I often teach civil procedure or procedural analysis, and that's a good course. That's not as exciting to the students as getting out and working and seeing what a lawyer's actually doing and helping write a brief or writing an analysis or writing a contract or doing something that's going to have a real impact in the local communities. We think it's critical. The other thing I should say is, I think it used to be thought, well, you do pro bono if you're interested in a public interest career. But the reality is, if you want to be a corporate lawyer doing, I don't know, private equity or M&A, or your plan is to go to Wall Street, you need to be able to build those skills of working with clients and figuring out how to interact and how to appear before judges, and getting those pro bono experiences allow you to do that at a much earlier stage than you're going to do in a very large law firm. And so it's a great networking ability. Most lawyers I know, as they get further in the career, they're committed to their community and engage in public interest work, in part because of the network it brings. And introducing students to the importance of that early on is important for their professional.
One of the things that I read on UCI's webpage is an emphasis on teaching professional identity. Can you tell our listeners about how professional identity is taught in modern law schools and the importance of that aspect of one's legal education?
Absolutely. So I think some of this came from a famous study back in the mid-2000s from the Carnegie Foundation on educating lawyers. And their analysis which was widely read, was that law schools did a really good job of teaching students how to think like a lawyer. They did an okay job of skills development, legal writing, trial practice, whatnot. And they did not a great job of what they refer to as the third apprenticeship, was how to think about a lifetime career and the values and norms around the profession and what it means to be a lawyer. So partly professional identity is having students understand a little bit about the business of law, what law firms do. Most students come into law school and they've heard of big law. They don't know what it is, but they know it's large, and they know it's something to do with New York or LA or large city. And they also know about human rights work and public interest work. So they've heard about working at Cravath, and they've heard about doing human rights work in Cambodia. But that's not what most lawyers do. And it's not what most lawyers are going to do over a lifetime career. So, for example, for us, we have a mandatory first-year course on the legal profession where we bring in 6 panels of lawyers of different areas of law, and they talk about what they do and how they got started. And then students are required to interview a lawyer to talk about how they started their career. And it's designed to give students a broader idea about what lawyers actually do and how they build their careers, and what are the values and norms in the profession that distinguish lawyers from other professions, and how you build a reputation. And we have somebody come in on the very first day of orientation, or the first couple of days of orientation, to talk about building a profession and how you're sworn into the bar after you graduate, and you promise you're not going to steal, or you're not going to do bad things. It seems a little late, right? Like, professional career begins when you're starting law school, and your classmates are going to be your colleagues for many, many years, and they'll refer business and they'll be part of the community. And so thinking about how you build that reputation from day one is critical. And I think that's sort of the third prong of part of legal education, which is thinking about what it means to be a legal profession and how you build that, whether that's your pro bono work, whether that's the kind of lawyer, how you represent yourself, the level of care that you have to your clients, or the way that you present yourself, and talking to students about that sort of professional aspect. And that can be simple, like how you appear in court, but it can be more sophisticated of how is the legal profession constituted and what are the challenges that the legal profession have. So that may be one way of thinking about professional identity.
Can you tell our listeners how law schools have now placed a greater emphasis on the professionalization of legal writing and what that looks like, particularly at UCI.
Yeah, of course, Ray. Well, if you go back to, I don't know who taught you legal writing, but it often used to be taught by third-year students. And then for a while, it was taught by wonderful adjuncts, but who had very limited time. And then sometimes it was taught in programs by PhD or graduate students in law. Now it's almost always taught by full-time faculty who had significant practical experience, 5, 6, 10 years of practice. We have people here who were partners in very large law firms for quite some time before they began teaching lawyering skills and legal writing. And then the literature around how to teach students legal writing and legal research has also increased. So there's national organizations like the Legal Writing Institute and an organization called Allwood, which is the Association of Legal Writing Directors. And they think carefully about the pedagogy around teaching legal writing and how to do it in an effective way, and making sure that what we're teaching in law schools is consistent with the changes that are occurring in practice. And that's different. It used to be much more sort of an afterthought by schools. Now it's a core part of the first year curriculum at most schools. And for most schools, as I say, it's taught by very sophisticated faculty who have had significant amount of practical experience before they went into academia.
I would have to attest that that's very different from what it was when I was going to law school. So that's great.
Yeah, the other thing I might add, it used to be that you would just write an appellate brief for the United States Supreme Court in sort of a landmark case. And so you'd often do your writing and you'd write in the U.S. Supreme Court brief. Now, a lot of legal writing and lawyering skills programs are focused on things like email and maybe drafting a little bit of discovery or writing a memo that's not a formal memo, but more likely what partners are looking for, writing summary judgment motions rather than Supreme Court appellate briefs. And there's nothing wrong with the Supreme Court appellate brief. It's a great training mechanism. But the reality is most students from most law schools are not going to be doing the United States Supreme Court argument in the first year after graduation, while a wide range of people are going to have to do summary judgment motions, discovery, writing emails to clients and to partners, writing memos to partners. And so there's been a switch to focusing on those skills that students are most likely to see early on in their careers. That's not uniform, but that's true at many schools, and it's certainly true at UC Irvine.
How has AI been incorporated into the teaching of law?
Yeah, in a couple of ways. So I think we're maybe you might think of this in three buckets. So one, we're still thinking about how faculty discuss how AI should be used by students in their classes, right? We don't want students just throwing everything into some AI engine and turning in their brief from, asking the AI to write the brief for them. And so we have a number of rules and thinking about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. Second, then, is actually teaching students how to use AI in an appropriate way, right? And there's legitimate and valuable uses of AI in short-circuiting some initial research that's very, very useful. And certainly in some of the broader skills about law firm practice management, I think we're going to see AI take on a broader role. And third, then, is talking about how AI is actually changing the profession in particular areas, right? Actually changing the way that lawyers do their jobs and predicting how we might see changes in structure. And so faculty are talking about AI in a lot of different contexts. Some faculty use AI themselves to assist in sort of maybe preparing slides or preparing course materials, but only I think still in pretty minimal forms. I think there's a distrust around the accuracy of many of these AI programs. And although they may be useful, for example, in helping you calendar meetings with students, a sort of mundane task, I think there's a reluctance on the core skills that we're teaching. It's changing, but there's still limitations with those programs.
Don't you find it astounding that there are still attorneys out there who will file a brief with a court that has completely fabricated citations to authority that was created out of thin air by AI?
Yeah, no, I think astounding because it's been so publicly, it's been covered so much, and it's well known it's a problem, and it just reflects sloppiness. I think, though, it's part of maybe a broader issue, which is that many lawyers just don't have the time they need, and things are tight for many lawyers and in the amount of time they can spend on matters. That doesn't provide any sort of excuse. If you're just relying on it, you're just not doing your job. But I think it is a reflection about how, at least in some practice areas, it's difficult to be able to do what you need to do. And I think that's why it becomes easy for people to move to AI. But it's astounding. It's been so clearly covered in civil procedure. I now have a number of cases with that are sort of cut with lawyers, with judges in pretty strict language, criticizing lawyers who have made these mistakes and sanctioning them. And so I just can't imagine a lawyer these days doing that, not checking the brief. It's a easy path to malpractice.
Do you believe that the role of a newly graduated law student will be different in the next 5 years than it has been traditionally?
I think definitely, although I'm going to put a little bit of caveat on that. So first, I think the profession has always been evolving and changing. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago, are lawyers doing exactly today what they were doing 5 years ago? The answer would be no. I think the speed, or at least the speed in which things are changing, seems to be ever increasing. And so I think the legal profession has always been good at adaptation and evolution, but it certainly does feel like things are happening at a faster pace. And so I think it is true that new students will be doing different things. On the other hand, in some ways, the traditional skills of lawyering, analytical thinking, problem solving, thinking like a lawyer, clear communication, being an effective advocate, I think those skills are going to remain even more important. And as you talk to people, as they see the changes that technology is having to the profession, those soft skills and those critical thinking skills are become even more valuable. And so I don't think you're going to see that change. I think the core part of what it means to be a good lawyer is going to remain the same. The day-to-day ways that lawyers practice, I think, is evolving. And I think we're going to see it continuing to evolve at a pretty quick pace as we see technology and not just technology, but also increased competition at a national and global level among firms continue.
What do you foresee being the most significant change law schools will undergo, say, in the next 10 years?
So I'm not great at predicting. If I was, I would be much better at the stock market. But I think there's a couple of things that we can see is happening. So I think currently we're in a difficult moment because a lot of what law schools do and what a lot of universities do is misunderstood and has been sort of caught up a little bit in the political polarization of the day. And so I think we're seeing a big move to deregulation. There's the criticism of the American Bar Association's council, which is the accreditor of law schools. We're seeing big changes in the way the bar exam is being contemplated, both here in California and nationally with the next-gen bar exam. I think we're going to, just as I mentioned with law firms, I think we're going to continue to see the globalization of the legal profession, which means that law schools that used to be more regional are going to continue to see increased competition nationally and also internationally through online education, increased competition for students, increased competition for good faculty. And so I think that puts a lot of pressure on the traditional model, both to be innovative in the way that we teach students, but also innovative in the way that law schools are structured and operated. In some ways, law schools aren't that much different, I think, from large law firms. Law firms have seen changes because of increased competition and the need to maintain sort of the core aspects of what a partnership means and the commitment to being a legal professional, but at the same time having to adapt to a very competitive global marketplace where the margins are tighter in some ways than they used to be, and the competition for the very top work is fierce. And I think that's true also for law schools. That's going to force competition. Now, how that plays out, does that mean we'll see more online law schools, more online education? Are we going to continue to see more moves to skills-based education or a push back to more traditional critical thinking skills as we adapt to AI? That's hard to predict, but I think it's going to be a place where you see lots of innovation and lots of change, and in part because of competition and part because of deregulation and because of the moment we're in, where a lot of these questions about higher education and cost of education are prominent.
Are there things that young attorneys can do to future-proof their law practices to the extent that's even possible?
Yeah, I think it's one is a mindset of thinking about lifelong learning, right? That it's not that you just finished law school and now you're a lawyer and you're done, but how do you constantly think about how you improve as a lawyer? That might be the traditional way. That might be thinking about, do you read a book on effective writing so that each year and every time you write a brief, you might be a little more effective in the way you're writing? Do you have a process by which you think about what you're doing that's sort of mindful in the way that you're trying to improve? Do you have that commitment to excellence? You see this with young associates in firms, that I think the ones that are most successful are the ones that are thinking about how they grow and how they respond to feedback from clients and partners and others. And so I think one way of future-proofing is sort of having that mindset that you're going to be adaptable and flexible, and that you're thinking about building not only short-term skills for success, but also longer-term skills. And that longer-term skills means that these days careers change. One of the things that's striking is the data about how mobile lawyers are. The idea of people starting with one firm and staying through a career is relatively rare now. You see much more movement, both laterally among partners and also among associates. In fact, lawyers, one of the things they say they appreciate most about being a lawyer is the mobility and the new challenges as they change slightly their focuses. And you see some areas they used to be really robust practices that have now become not so much robust practices, and people have had to adapt. So I think going into legal practice with that mindset of change is probably the most important. And then the second thing related to, as I mentioned, is how do you have a process for lifelong learning? When I was in law practice, doing a CLE was something you had to do that you didn't really look forward to, but you had to do it. But there are some good programs, right, on how to think through how to change your practice to adapt to new emerging areas, and how to become an expert, and how to build your resume in new areas so that you can adapt. And I think thinking through the ways you do that practically is useful. To me, it's that sort of mindset of adaptability and flexibility and a willingness to continue to learn.
Can you tell us about your work with the Association of American Law Schools and the AccessLex Institute?
Absolutely. I'm really fortunate. Those are two amazing organizations. So the Association of American Law Schools, which is often known as AALS, is the learned society. It's for most law schools nationwide, about 180 of the 200 ABA accredited schools are members or affiliated. And it's very much a faculty-driven association. They coordinate hiring of new faculty nationwide. They provide programming for deans, programming for new faculty, programming for clinical faculty. And it's basically, they provide convenings for faculty to talk about their research, about new pedagogical techniques, about thinking about changes to legal education. This winter in January in New Orleans, we'll have a conference with about 2,000 attendees that will have over 200 presentations or panels. We'll have managing partners from leading firms, Supreme Court justices from state courts. We'll have deans from most of the law schools and faculty and staff, and they'll come together and talk about important issues. And that's a great organization. And then AccessLex Institute is a nonprofit organization. It's probably the largest nonprofit focused on access and affordability and financial literacy for students in the nation. And they really think about how do you support students early on in college that are thinking about going to law school, and then how do you provide support to legal professionals? These are professionals in law schools in either admissions or student affairs or financial aid, to be able to provide support for students so that they can succeed. Some of this is around academic support that never used to exist in law schools, but are now fairly robust. Some of it's around financial literacy, and so they provide free financial literacy programs to all students about how to think about managing finances. And some of that is to do with student loans, but some of that's just how do you balance a checkbook and how do you take out your first mortgage? So basic life skills. And then they've been very instrumental in thinking about how students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and underrepresented backgrounds, how to reduce some of the barriers to be thinking about law schools. The data shows that if you don't mention the idea of law school to a student by the time they're 10th grade in high school, that their chances of attending, unless their parents were lawyers, is much less. So how do you get the information out about law as a career? Yeah, those are two great organizations. I've been on the board of AccessLex for over a decade, and I've been on the Association of American Law Schools Executive Committee for 5 or so years. And I'm absolutely privileged to be able to serve as the president of the association this year. And it's been a busy year for us. There's a lot of issues, new loan legislation around graduate education, these proposed compacts, the threats to law firms, the threats to judges. The uptick of physical violence threats to judges and their families have been stunning. And then we've been involved in, there's a major effort with the Conference of Chief Justices and the National Center for State Courts to thinking about how we prepare students and we've been involved in those conversations as we think through what are the types of ways that law schools should evolve and adapt to meet the moment. And so two wonderful organizations and an absolute privilege to serve on both of them.
Dean Parrish, have you ever asked that one question too many?
I'm worried that I've done that way too many times, and I'm thinking back to my trial advocacy professor who would be horrified that I did it. I think as a young lawyer, it's hard to hold off and not do that last question, and it's I think it's a great lesson for a young lawyer. You can kind of almost tell that you're about to do it and realize that you've gone one question too far.
Dean Parrish, thank you for being with us today. It's been wonderful. Would you please tell our listeners the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me say, Stephen Ray, it's been absolutely wonderful to be with you. Always nice to talk about law schools and legal education. I think email is probably the best way to reach me, and your listeners can reach me directly at aparish, that's APARRISH, at law.uci.edu. And if you forget that and you just type in Austen Parrish Dean at UCI, it'll pop up right away on a Google search. Yeah, and I really enjoyed this. It's always nice to talk to people. I've been an admirer of your podcast, and it was kind of you to invite me to join the conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure having you on.